All right. Welcome to lesson 2. You haven't even had any homework yet. So this next lesson is about standard chord symbols in jazz. This is another one of those things that I'd just as soon not sit around for hours and talk about it at a retreat, but it's a really good topic to talk on a video before the retreat. So there are certain ways to write your chords that are going to help you have your music be read the best, I have found. For instance, I tend to avoid certain things, like I tend to avoid the minus. A lot of people use a minus sign for minor chords. I tend to avoid it, and why is it? Because you can't even see it sometimes, and when your music gets photocopied in any way or something like that, the minus sign is the first thing to go. I'm also not a big fan of the triangle while we're talking about symbols. The triangle was a Berklee College of Music thing that they started back in the 80s, and most people now they think that that's the equivalent of a major chord, or a major 7 or major 6 chord. It's fine if you want to use the triangle, use the triangle. But sometimes I find that messy triangles look like diminished. They look like diminished circles. So somebody might read that as a diminished chord. So my go-tos are MI, MA, and then writing out the word dim. Half diminished is up to you, whether you use a diminished 7 sign or half dim. I've seen that as well, half dim 7. And then finally the minor, major, diminished, and a dominant. I knew I was missing one. The dominant's the easiest one to deal with. You just write the 7 for dominant 7. That's not ever a major 7 chord. If there's nothing written in terms of may or my, then it's just the dominant 7. So we have MI7, MA7, diminished 7, half diminished 7, and 7. Now, you have a sheet that has some standard chord symbols. You'll notice that there is, let's go right down the list. The first grouping is all of your major chords. And you have a C add 9 chord. That's actually not even a 4-note, it's not even a jazz chord in a sense that there's no 7th. When it says C add 9, then it's actually asking you to write a C major or play a C major triad and then just add the 9. Now 9 is another way of saying 2. And many of you probably know that, but anytime you've got upper numbers, anything higher than 8, then you can subtract the number 7 and you'll find out what that note really is. So for instance, when I call it a 9, it's just a fancy way of saying a 2. 9 minus 7 equals 2. The same thing happens for 11ths. If you want to know what an 11 is, you can subtract 7 and you get 4. So that's the 4 of the scale. You've got 13, which if you take a 13 minus 7, then a 13 is a fancy way of saying a 6. Now your next question is probably going to be, how do I know whether to call it a 13 or a 6? And what I'll tell you is that when you use the lower number, it implies that there's no 7. So, for instance, a major 6 chord will not have a 7th in there. However, if I call it a major 13 chord, then I am implying that there's also a major 7 in there as well, if that makes sense. In the same way that a minor 11 chord is going to have a 7th in it. So that the biggest confusion comes with 6 and 6 and 13, I would say. So just think, if it's a major 6 chord, there's no 7th in there. So we just dealt with a C add 9. We have a C triad, that's easy enough. We've got a C major 7, also easy. C major 9, you guys all aced this part of your diagnostic. A C6-9 chord. Now on your worksheet, you'll notice that the 6-9 aren't exactly lined up. That's just the fault of my word processing program. It should be 6 on top of the 9. So we have C6-9 chord implies that there is now a 6 and also a 9 in it as well. This is the only chord that you'll see that actually implies that there's not a 7 in there. There's not a major 7, although you're going to tell me, Jeremy, why did you just tell us that any number above 8 implies that there's a 7th in there? In this one instance, it kind of goes against it because it's very specifically telling you, nope, it's a 6 and a 9. Those are the two notes that we want to use in there, not the 7. This is a very handy chord, by the way, a C6-9 chord. We run into it quite a bit. So beyond that, those are the major 7 and the major 6 types of chords that I would recommend you use and you think about often. There's certainly we can alter certain tones like a sharp 11, and that's a whole nother discussion. But those are the very basic standard chord symbols for major chords. For dominant 7 chords, we've got a C7 chord. We've got a C9 chord, and a C9 chord just implies that you are adding the 9. C9, a C13 chord. You see that quite a bit. A C13 chord implies now that there is also a 7th in there. And if you want to get specific, a C13 chord actually implies that there's a 9 in there as well. And you would wonder, why on earth is that the case? Well, I'll tell you in a later lesson that 9s are like actually a very standard jazz note. There's nothing fancy about it. It's just, it's a pretty stock, like it's a well-liked jazz note. So if it doesn't tell you that it's a flat 9 or a sharp 9, then probably this implies that there's a natural 9 in there as well. Otherwise, it would have told you C13 flat 9 or C13 sharp 9. But because it didn't tell you that, you can imply it implies that there's a natural 9 in there. Beyond that, now we're dealing with chord symbols that have C7 sharp 11. In the same way, you can now imply that there's a 9 to that chord as well, unless it tells you otherwise. 9s are fine. 9s are divine. They go well with wine. 9s are, yes, they're fine. They're great. They are great notes always. So that's your C7 sharp 11. Now we get to instances like C7 flat 9. Obviously, when it tells you to flat the 9, we're not going to use a natural 9. And there's a rule of thumb that I'll mention in a later video as well, that if you're using a flat 9, you don't want to use another alteration in the chord that's a half step away from that note. So I will explain that later, but for instance, you will not have a natural 9 and a flat 9 in this chord. You could, as arrangers, you could choose to have a flat 9 and a sharp 9 in a particular chord voicing, but that's a later lesson. For now, you just need to know that no two color tones or alterations should be next to each other that are a half step apart. So then we have a C13 flat 9 chord on your page. We have a C7 sharp 9 flat 13. Some people call that a sharp 9 sharp 5 chord. Whether you call it a flat 13 or a sharp 5, I think that's up for debate. I've heard different jazz people call that flat 13, sharp 5, flat 13. It's the big debate. Is it a lowered 13 or a raised 5? The answer is yes, in my book. I do like calling it a sharp 5 in a way because you could call this a C7 sharp 9 sharp 5 chord. And I just like saying that. C7 sharp 9 sharp 5. It rolls off the tongue really nicely. So on your sheet here, that's the end of our dominant 7s. Now we get to minor 7 chords. And we're more than halfway through, actually. So on our minor chords, we've got the same type of thing. Minor 7, we have a minor 9 chord, and of course the minor 9 chord implies the 7 is in there. We have a minor 6 chord where there's no 7th in the chord. We have a minor 13 chord. Now, a minor 13 implies that there's a 7 and a 6 in there. By the way, since we're at the end of our minor chords here, I should mention that a C minor 6 chord does not imply that the 6th is minor or that the 6 is lowered. Think about that. It's actually a C minor 6 chord. C minor 6. This minor does not belong to the 6. This minor actually belongs to the C. So it's a C minor triad with a natural 6, or a raised. If you're thinking about it as a natural minor scale, then it would be a raised 6. If you're thinking about it as modes, it would be the Dorian mode. So the Dorian 6th, or the raised, naturalized. It's funny, all these words, it's tough to talk about. But the C minor 6 means that it's a C minor triad with a raised 6, not a minor 6, or not a lowered 6. So now we've gotten to augmented chords, and I'm a big fan of not using symbols, as I've already mentioned. So a C plus 7, to me, that's a no-no. Instead of C plus 7, I would rather write C7 sharp 5. Just call it what it is. Because otherwise, people do get confused, and they think that this plus belongs to the 7. C plus 7 is what they think. And that's not correct. It would actually be a C augmented triad with a dominant 7. In fact, some people even think that this is a type of 7th chord, an augmented 7 chord. That's not true. It's a dominant 7 chord with a sharp 5. So I'm anti-symbols. I'm anti-plus, anti-minus, anti-triangle. The only symbol that I'm okay with is the diminished symbol, since that's used in classical theory as well quite a bit. And that brings us to our diminished chords. We have the C circle, or if you rather, C diminished. Now that implies a triad. If you want it to be a diminished 7th chord, then we have to write the 7 in, of course. We've got besides that, a half diminished, and again, that can either be that symbol, So it's the circle with the line through it. You write that even a little better. Or C minor 7, flat 5. Notice how I write it. C, Mi7, flat 5. And you'll notice the reason why I do that, Mi, because nobody's going to mistake that for a major chord. And worse yet is when you've got people who handwrite chord changes and they write their M like this, and you can't tell whether it's a major or a minor type of a chord. So beyond that, we've got the specialty chords at the bottom of this chart. We've got a C7 sus chord, or C7 sus 11. We'll have a whole discussion about sus chords, so I'm not even going to talk about that right now. But it is a C dominant 7 sus chord is a 4-note voicing. So there are at least 4 notes in that chord, if not more than that. The chords that follow, a C sus 4, now all of a sudden we're dealing with only 3 notes. So we've got, this is a pretty typical, you've heard this in chorales, you've heard it in pop music, a C sus 4 chord. All it implies is that the 4th is the substitution for the 3rd, and that there's no 7th. No 7th at all in a C sus 4. Now think about what I said earlier. Because it's a lower number, a C sus 4, there's no 7 in the chord. And the same thing with a C sus 2. In the classical world, we would call a sus 2 chord kind of a retardation. It would be a 9-3 or a 2-3 retardation. Retardation is just a suspension that resolves upwards. So a C sus 2 is going to have, instead of C E G, it's going to be C D G. C D G. You can go back and forth between sus 4 and triad, and sus 2 and triad, sus 4. You get the point. Sus 2. And the only other thing I wanted to bring to your attention on this particular lesson is the last thing on the bottom of the page. C triad over an F. C/F. In the jazz world, that means that the bass player is playing a single note, F, and the chord on top of that, or in the right hand, for instance, of a piano player, would be a major triad in this particular case. C/F. C major triad over an F in the bass. If we're dealing with Charles Ives music, then we might be dealing with a C major triad over an F major triad. But 99% of the time in jazz, what we're talking about here when we write a slash is that the slash means that it's a single note in the bass part or in your left hand of the piano.